What's going on, ChavezzSlovakia? We're here finally for some Halloween stuff, an H.P. Lovecraft special. His racism and anti-Semitism aside, it's kind of hard to separate it because he not only was it hinted at in his works, he wrote poetry about, the differences between blacks and whites, made speeches about how blacks were inferior to whites, and he even supported Hitler in his anti-Semitism. He was against the Jewish people, to say the least. But yet, his pervasiveness and importance in the writing community kind of still holds up. This way of thinking about the world, be it skewed at some points, was I think important to kind of remember. But you need to put it into perspective because sometimes people have a hard time. And it's no fault of anyone's. You have an entire right to not like someone because of their belief system, right? Like, that's completely okay. But it's just what he adds to, the Stephen Kings, Ridley Scott. There are a lot of good writers that you can go to and ignore H.P. Lovecraft completely. But I think he has a good place in in a Halloween type place. So we will touch on him need be. So we're here with Overly Sarcastic Productions. They have a pretty realistic grip on people's influence in history in general. So I know, I won't say Christina, Skitten really loves red. She's starting to mess with blue a lot too, but she really likes red. So that's where we're going to start. So let's get into it.
It would be inaccurate to describe Howard Phillips Lovecraft as a man with issues. It's more like he was a bundle of issues shambling around in a roughly bipedal approximation of a man. Chronically depressed, hypersensitive to criticism, almost certainly agoraphobic, prone to horrible nightmares and nervous breakdowns, and thoroughly racist even by the standards of the time, it'd be easy to come to the conclusion that H.P. Lovecraft was simply afraid of everything. But this isn't true either. He was just afraid of everything that wasn't his hometown of Providence, Rhode Island. Lovecraft is famous for codifying the Lovecraftian horror mythos, a cosmology he created with centralized themes of cosmic horror, ancient unknowable and malevolent gods, and everything smelling vaguely of fish. Lovecraft's writing is famous these days for producing an overwhelming sense of sheer hopeless terror at an unfeeling cosmos, wrapped up in visceral descriptions of omnipresent rot and decay, all themes that manage to make perfect sense when contextualized with Lovecraft's life story, which was pretty much a depressing downward spiral from minute one. Lovecraft was born in 1890 to one of those well-off New England families that still thought of themselves as proper English semi-nobility, an image that became harder and harder to maintain due to their perpetual state of financial decline. Lovecraft was intermittently schooled but never really finished his education, and had access to a decent library with pretty nifty scientific texts, but had too delicate of a constitution for math, and as such made no progress beyond the basics in any of his fields of scientific study, which explains his thorough misunderstanding of non-Euclidean geometry, non-visible light, and the concept of an air conditioner. His mother was institutionalized in 1918, but unfortunately we have no idea what was actually wrong with her because the medicine of the time had a tendency to exclusively diagnose women with hysteria, aka being a woman disease. When she died in 1921, Lovecraft took it really hard, got severely depressed, and started writing The Call of Cthulhu, one of the first stories that brought themes of existential horror into his developing mythos. Lovecraft's lack of marketable skills stopped being much of a problem for him when he married a breadwinner businesswoman in 1924, and moved into his wife's apartment in Brooklyn, which he hated more than anything, in large part because New York is one of those places where immigrants happen. Oh yeah, the racism. So Lovecraft's proper New England breeding was a major source of pride for him, and basically all of his stories have seriously classist and racist themes, with his heroes being well-educated white dudes with no phonetically transcribed accents, and his villains being literally everybody else. This being good old English racism, he cared less about skin color directly and more about breeding overall, so there's a number of white people bad guys too, albeit uneducated, inbred, and poor, but it's no accident a lot of his horror is derived from people crossbreeding with other races. Part of this might have been Lovecraft's clear and obvious discomfort and disinterest with all things sexual, but there's also a bunch of racism wrapped up in there. Lovecraft eventually got overwhelmed by the horror of the outside world and moved back home to Providence, lived on a dwindling inheritance for the rest of his life, and died almost completely unknown from intestinal cancer at age 46. Overall, an unpleasant life steeped in mundane misery and crippled by fear at every turn.
Also a really good overview.
With the context of Lovecraft's overwhelming disgust and horror for everything he didn't understand, almost his entire body of work begins to make sense. The thing that makes Lovecraftian horror, and the thing that's kept it popular, is this overwhelming fear of the unknown, a concept that easily translates even as the unknown changes with social and scientific developments. Even though Lovecraft's works haven't aged well at all, the underlying principle is sound. If you don't fully understand something, you can interpolate existential horror and turn every mystery into a nightmare of things man was not meant to know. And separate from that, the aesthetic of horror he chose is also pretty effective on its own. zone. Lovecraft's overwhelming fear of the ocean produced a memorable and viscerally nasty horror aesthetic grounded in slime and rot that was far removed from the cold stone sterility of the previous gothic horror genre. So, all that in mind, let's take a look at a few of the genre-defining short stories cranked out from Horrible Phobias Lovecraft's darkest nightmares.
Let's do it!
The Call of Cthulhu is framed as a first-person account from one Francis Wayland Thurston, whose venture into the unknown begins as he's going through the notes left by his great-uncle George Angel, a professor at Brown who recently died under mysterious circumstances. The notes describe a series of interactions between Angel and one Henry Anthony Wilcox, an artist and known airhead who's recently taken to dreaming of ancient sunken cities. An earthquake hit New England on February 28, and that night, Henry had this crazy dream that he was navigating an ancient, creepy city covered in green ooze and hieroglyphs, and from the depths of the structure echoed a very spooky voice saying something about Cthulhu in a language he didn't understand. Angel is disproportionately concerned about this dream and asks if Henry is, by any chance, part of a cult, but Henry's just your average clean-cut New England artist dreaming of things beyond mortal ken. He comes in daily with new dreams, all in the same city but sometimes different parts of it, and with the same spooky voice saying spooky stuff, until one day, March 23rd, when he doesn't come in at all, because as it turns out, Henry's become very sick and has been deliriously yelling about some giant monster. 9 days later, Henry abruptly gets better and stops having the dreams entirely. Angel launches an investigation, polling a large population for reports of what their dreams were like during the interval when Henry was all wonky. He discovers that salt-of-the-earth working-class folk were totally unaffected, sciencey types had the occasional nightmare, and artists and poets were almost incapacitated by their crazy nightmares. Many of them dreamt of the same city as Henry, along with the same ominous chanting he reported. Overall, the interval between February 28th and April 2nd saw a worldwide spike in madness, mania, and general unrest. That's pretty spooky all on its own, but it turns out Angel had asked Henry about cult activity for a reason. This wasn't his first run-in with the name Cthulhu. 17 years prior, in 1908, Angel is attending an academic archaeological get-together when hard-boiled New Orleans cop Inspector Legrasse crashes the party with an ancient and creepy statuette they recently confiscated from a particularly nasty cult, and they need to know what it means. The statuette looks like a weird half-human, half-octopus, half-dragon thing. The archaeologists pass it around, but nobody can identify the culture of origin and nobody can read the glyphs. The one dude claims he's dealt with a tribe of devil worshippers who seem to have worshipped a similar figure. When asked where the heck he got this statue, Legrasse explains they'd gotten some reports from some friendly swamp-dwelling New Orleansers that some seriously freaky stuff was happening in the swamp, and their women and children kept getting kidnapped. The cops crashed the party and found a large number of very naked cultists dancing around a burning monolith with the statuette on top, surrounded by the extremely dead bodies of all those kidnapped swamp people. Oh, but don't worry, circa 1920s New England readers. I know you want to know the exact ethnic backgrounds and skin color of these cultists before you render moral judgment. Well, don't you worry, Lovecraft has you covered. We've got some Native Americans, some black people, some biracial people, some ethnically ambiguous folk thrown in for flavor, and basically everybody who's definitely not a white people. I won't say Lovecraft got subtler about his deep, abiding loathing and terror of anyone with a skin tone darker than Pantone 727, but this is probably the most all-inclusive it ever gets in his writing. Anyway, Lovecraft's charmingly diverse death cult explains that they worship the Great Old Ones, ancient gods who predate humanity and are currently dead, but still dreaming, and through their dreams can communicate with humanity, which is how they facilitated the formation of this ancient globe-spanning cult in the first place. The Old Ones are currently all preserved in the ancient city of Relay, which sunk into the ocean a while back, which makes it harder for them to psychically bump up with humanity. Cthulhu is the name of one of the Old Ones, specifically the one playing nanny to all the others while they're dead and waiting for the stars to align so they can come back. So our narrator Francis understands why Angel was so freaked out at hearing the name Cthulhu 17 years after dealing with the murder cult, but is pretty sure this must have been some kind of practical joke, and decides to start investigating on his own. Also, he begins to suspect Angel might have been killed by the cult, because shortly before he died, he bumped into a black guy. I can't stress enough how hard it is to read this today. After retracing Angel's contacts to try and flesh out the story, he finds a newspaper article dated to the same time frame as Henry's crazy dreams that talks about a derelict ship found adrift at sea with a single survivor on board. A man named Johansson, who you know you can trust because he's Norwegian, aka very, very white. According to the article, Johansson claimed the ship had been attacked by a yacht full of suspicious not white people, but they managed to kill all of them, board the yacht, and sailed along its original course, whereupon they landed on an island that didn't
This is when the shit gets really
appear on any
interesting.
map. 6 of the crew members somehow died, and Johansson and one other made it back to the boat, at which point the other one died too. Francis bounces around the globe a bit trying to locate this Johansson, who he finds
That's a pretty interesting, preface,
Tragically died quite recently, but conveniently left a whole lot of notes for him to sift through. Hooray! So the notes are basically just Johansson's horrified recollection of his harrowing ordeal, which fills in what the newspaper left out. The ship lands on an island that shouldn't exist, surprise, surprise, the topmost part of Relay, and as they explore, the sailors note that the island is extremely spooky because all of its architecture is non-Euclidean. For those of you with a Lovecraftian level geometry education, non-Euclidean Euclidean geometry is just geometry on a curved surface. You may note, since we live on a globe, all of our geometry is non-Euclidean. Anyway, the island's terrifying geometry notwithstanding, the sailors soldier on until they encounter a very big door. Following, I guess, video game logic, the sailors agree that opening this very big door sounds like a fun idea, and surprise, surprise, Cthulhu comes out. Way to do the Colt's job for him, geniuses. So 2 of the sailors die of fright, 1 trips on a corner and clips through the map, and 3 of them get squished. Johansson and 1 other guy exit pursued by Cthulhu, and once in the boat, Johansson, brave Snow White Norwegian that he is, turns the boat around and rams the pursuing Cthulhu right in his big jello-y face. It smells awful, there's jelly everywhere, but as the boat retreats, Cthulhu is seen pulling himself back together, because if you could kill an elder god the same way you kill a rampaging Disney villain, most of Lovecraft's stories would have very different tones. Anyway, Johansson's hair turns white from the shock, his crew member looked at Cthulhu for too long and went crazy, and that's where the story ends. Relay evidently sunk back under the sea since the island is gone, and Francis wraps up the story by contemplating how now that he knows so much about Cthulhu, it seems likely that his evil death cult is probably going to be gunning for him any day now. Oh no! How will he be able to function in polite society if he's cripplingly paranoid that every not white person he runs into might be trying to... I'm just kidding, it's 1920s rural America, no one will notice. Cool Air was written while Hippopotamus Lovecraft was living in New York City, and consequently takes place in a crowded apartment building full of immigrants, every element of which the narrator hates. Even worse, one night something gross starts leaking through his ceiling, and the landlady explains a reclusive and mysterious doctor, homebound due to a lasting illness, lives in the apartment above him and must have spilled one of his chemicals. The knowledge that his upstairs neighbor is a doctor becomes relevant when our narrator randomly has a heart attack one day and scoots upstairs for some pro bono medical attention. He finds that his neighbor, Dr. Munoz, is a very tidy and well-groomed dude, who our narrator judges as being of superior blood and breeding, but he keeps his apartment really cold for some reason, and also comes across as inexplicably creepy, talking the whole time he's treating our narrator, but seemingly never pausing for breath. Place your bets now, folks. Anyway, Munoz tells the narrator not to be too narrator, but seemingly never pausing for breath. I want to place my bets. Place your bets.
I would like to do this. Oh, okay, just kidding. Never mind, it's extremely obvious. I'll still pick A, but I know it's not.
Now, folks. Anyway, Munoz tells the narrator not to be too down about his poor health, since modern science is incredible and can sustain a human body almost indefinitely. He himself has had a complex bouquet of medical issues for the past 18 years, which is why he keeps his apartment so cold and rarely leaves. Fun fact.
That doesn't make a lot of sense.
This story was written only a few years after air conditioning began to become a widespread phenomenon in major US cities, which is probably why Munoz takes the time to explain how exactly his cooling system works, and also why Hates Progress Lovecraft is so scared of it. Anyway, the narrator likes having such interesting company and routinely returns for visits and conversation, though he does notice that the doctor's health continues to deteriorate, and he does increasingly frantic modifications to the AC in order to compensate. He winds up looking so creepy that he gives a hardened war veteran a seizure just by looking at him. Basically, homeboy's face is jacked. Then one warm night mid-October, the air conditioner breaks, and the doctor freaks out and locks himself in the bathroom while he sends the narrator out to bring him as much ice as he can manage, as well as arrange for repairs. The narrator subcontracts a dude to keep the ice coming while he runs off to find repair people, but when he returns to the house, it's in total chaos. Apparently, the ice guy got curious and looked into the bathroom, then ran screaming from the building. Upon investigation, a trail of God knows what leads from the bathtub to the writing desk and then dead ends in a pile of something horrible on the couch. It's so horrible, the narrator doesn't even want to describe it, attempting to preserve the horror of the unknown, even though at this point we all know it's the doctor. Anyway, he wrote out a last confession about how he's been dead for 18 years and staved off decay through the cold and a lot of chemicals, but now thanks to the failure of modern technology, death has finally come for him. Yay!
Damn.
At this point, most of us
okay, what is the thing?
Come for him. Yay!
That's really cool. That sounds like a good read, actually. Okay, phobia, space, aliens, non-visible light.
At this point, most of us learn the...
we will pause here. We'll go for a part 2 of impending horror, and maybe later on we'll get a more in-depth reading of Cthulhu, as maybe we could clean it up a little bit for the 21st century. Even though I'm a purist, I will allow YouTube to not destroy us on this. But I'm enjoying myself. I'll holler at you on the next one. Peace.